Righty. Good morning. It's still morning. My name is Ann Reynolds. I'm with the Alliance for Clean Energy New York, and I want to welcome you all to this seminar. This is the fourth seminar in a series that we've held since the beginning of 2023. The series is What's in the Plan, focused on what's in New York's climate scoping plan. So Climate Action Council, of which I was honored to be a part, and many staff from agencies spent a lot of time, invested a lot of time in developing New York's climate scoping plan that was finalized in December. And here at ACE New York, we wanted to have this seminar series because we wanted to talk about the plan and have folks have the opportunity to learn more details about what's in the plan, simply because we don't want this plan to get dusty on the shelf. We want it to be implemented and augmented and be successful in meeting New York's climate goals. The first seminar we had was on the plan in general, overall, and in its entirety. Then our second focused on buildings chapter. The third was focused on the transportation electrification issues and the transportation chapter more broadly. And today we're going to focus on the electricity sector and the electricity chapter. All of those seminars have been recorded, and this one's being recorded as well. They are available on the ACE New York website and on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and learn more about those, you're very welcome to. Now, I'm going to start with a little snapshot of the electricity electricity sector, I should say. So, Jared, you can go ahead and put the slides on the screen for today and go to the next slide. And before I start, I will also say that we're going to save plenty of time for questions, and I want you all to put your questions in the Q&A function. So don't put them in the chat, put your questions in Q&A, and we'll get to them towards the end. So the electricity chapter has 10 key strategies that we're going to talk about today. And the next slide has a snapshot of where we get our electricity from right now. So as you see from here, the good news is it's 50% zero emissions already. About 28% of that is renewable. The majority of that is hydroelectric power. We at the moment have 3%, or I should say, this was in 2021, have 3% of our electricity coming from the wind industry. But the picture looks different in different parts of the state, and the next slide shows this. You'll see here that while upstate we have 91% zero emissions, downstate that number is much smaller, and we have 89% fossil fuel. So that's part of the challenge. We need to not just have clean, renewable electricity, but we need to get it everywhere it needs to go. And so on our next slide, you'll see, we're not going to go into detail here, but it shows that the climate plan examined and modeled how much renewables we need to construct in order to meet the climate goals. This is from Appendix G of the plan, and there's charts like this for the various scenarios, of which there's 3. But the bottom line here is megawatts on the left. We need to build a lot of all types of renewables. And even when we get to 100% emissions free in 2040, we need to keep building because electricity demand is going to grow as we electrify transportation and buildings. And then on the right, you see the same data presented as gigawatt hours. And again, you see there's a diversity: offshore wind, land-based wind, hydro imports, in-state hydro. And then there also will be zero carbon emissions firm resources, which are called that in the climate plan. They're called dispatchable emission-free resources at the ISO, and we'll be hearing more about that today. So on the next slide, this is where we need to go. We need to get to a place where we have more renewables, we have more storage, and we need 10% of what I just mentioned, which is called dispatchable emissions-free resources. You'll hear more about those later. On the next slide, just want to point out that transmission is a climate action issue, and getting our transmission system ready for all of these renewables is something that is happening and needs to happen more. There's a lot of projects going on here, as you can see. And then in the next slide, we talk about how NYSERDA's procurement of renewables, which of course is an issue that's of great importance to a lot of ACE members, has accelerated. since 2017. So this is the good news. They've developed a lot more, or entered into a lot more contracts for megawatt hours of renewable electricity. And then on the next slide, I think it's, yeah, it just shows that a lot of those contracted projects are in various stages of development, right? So some are in their pre-application phase for their permit. Some have been canceled for a variety of reasons. About 14% are already operational. About a quarter of them have permits but haven't started construction yet. So I just wanted to show that there's a diversity in the status of these various projects that have contracts. So I think that's the last slide for me. And I am now going to, oh, is it? Yes. I'm now going to introduce our moderator. We are so lucky today to have Amanda Lefton join us to moderate this discussion. Amanda is Senior Policy Director at the law firm of Foley, Hoag. She's a national leader in renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure, and she's working with Foley Hoag now in the renewable energy, climate solutions, and environmental industries, and at both the federal and state levels. So she's busy, and she's in the firm's energy and climate group. But before that, Amanda was the director of the U.S. Department of Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So all of our offshore wind members are very familiar with her work. She spearheaded the development and implementation of the Biden administration's super ambitious offshore wind program. So we're so glad she was so successful there. And then prior to serving as BOEM director, Amanda was first assistant secretary for energy and the environment here in the state of New York, in Albany. She had a portfolio of 12 agencies, so she was equally busy there. And she was in that position when the landmark 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was enacted. So that, of course, is the law that led to the development of the climate scoping plan, which is the topic of today's discussion. So Amanda, thank you for helping us out here today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Anne, so much. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm so happy to be here with this really incredible panel today to talk about this really important topic. And of course, I really want to thank the Alliance for Clean Energy, particularly under your leadership, Anne, that has been such an important voice on these issues for so many years and really driving important progress towards achieving our climate goals. So Anne just laid out what is really, an incredible opportunity. We have, obviously a really long way to go to implement this really important portion of the Climate Action Council's scoping plan around the electric sector. And Anne just really detailed that while there's been a tremendous amount of progress through the great work here in New York State, there's still a long way to go. So fortunately, we have a really stellar panel here today to talk about that, how we're going to get there, the progress to date, and where we're heading. So first, we're going to hear from Emilie Nelson, who is the Executive Vice President at the New York State Independent System Operator. Then we're going to hear from Josh Berman, who is a senior attorney at the Sierra Club. And then we're going to finally hear from Vlad Gutman-Britten, who is the Assistant Director of Policy and Markets at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So first, to kick us off, I'm going to kick it to Emilie. Take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. And thanks so much for the opportunity to engage in this important conversation. Thanks to ACE New York and to Amanda and my fellow panel members. It's great to be here. So by way of introduction, I have a few slides. I tend to run through them pretty quickly because often I think I find and the audience finds that engaging in Q&A and discussion amongst the panel is really the most valuable part. But I do want to further frame the overview that Anne provided a great introduction to with respect to the electric sector. And the set of slides that I've pulled together really help describe further some of the challenges that we need to manage as an electric sector. And I often think about it as being able to hold the tension of addressing these challenges and talking about these challenges while still making forward progress on the long-term goals that we have here in New York. So with that, if you could go to the next slide. in New York, the New York ISO has the mission to ensure power system reliability and competitive markets for New York in a clean energy future. And we absolutely envision that in this state, we can create the cleanest, most reliable electric system in the nation. And that's what we're working toward. In the context of the CLCPA specifically, the Act has many components that envision a successful transformation of the electric grid. And I'd like to highlight just a few things that will be continuing themes throughout my remarks. It is critically important that we provide information on the transition of the grid and what will be necessary to successfully manage that change to the future state that's envisioned. Reliability and a reliable transition is essential as part of that work. There is a need for infrastructure, both on the supply side as well as transmission, in order to achieve this end state. It's necessary to understand and reformulate the processes that will be necessary to manage this transition, and to really think about how we can move more expeditiously through the work that's necessary. And certainly from the New York ISO's perspective, evolving the markets to make sure that there continues to be revenue streams, investment incentives that are working very much in concert with the activities underway by the state will be really important to achieve the level of investment that's required. Going to the next slide, just very briefly, we all have a role in being part of this transition, and here's what you can expect from us. We absolutely will continue to provide information about how the transition can occur reliably. We will continue to modify and operate the wholesale markets to incorporate new resources throughout this transition. Certainly, our planning function is more important than ever. So providing information about what the future state looks like and what we need to work through is critically important. And as always, it's very important to us that we are a trusted source of information on facts on where we are with respect to the electric grid. Moving to the next slide. This is a very simplified view of the Climate Act, which of course all of you know is multifaceted. But the reason I wanted to include it is because it highlights some of these themes that I just mentioned. When the New York ISO looks at the broad brushstrokes of the Act, of course we focus in on the electric sector. And what we see with this view is a tremendous need for infrastructure and investment. So the technology targets that are captured between solar and storage, offshore wind, continuing to build onshore renewables, as well as the mandate to have 70% of our energy come from renewable resources by 2030 means that we really need to move expeditiously on the investment on supply side resources as well as transmission. And Anne covered in her opening remarks the idea of dispatchable emission-free resources or zero emission resources. And when we look at the 2040 mandate to have a zero emission electric grid, that really brings to light the need to continue to have innovation and incentives to build out the technologies with the combination of attributes that will be necessary to simultaneously start to scale back the dependency on fossil resources. So there's a lot changing here. When we consider the overall economy-wide targets, the other thing that we often discuss here at the NYISO is what that's going to mean for demand. So on the demand side, what will the peak demand be? What will the load shapes look like? And how does that interact with the resources that will be available to reliably manage the transition throughout this tremendous change? Going to the next slide. Anne provided a nice view of the energy production graphs from 2021, and they'll look very familiar to this updated perspective, which is 2022 energy production. In the coming weeks, the New York ISO will release power trends, and we include a lot of graphics that provide a snapshot of where we currently are. So looking at 2022, you'll see that the numbers are quite similar. We're still about that 30% renewable energy production, and bringing that to mind in comparison to the 70% mandate for 2030, we obviously have quite a bit of work to continue to do. So if we go to the next slide, what are we doing on this? So one aspect of the transition is dealing with generator additions coincident with the retirements that are underway. Of course, the additions that we see both on the ground and increasingly in our interconnection queue tend to be renewable and storage resources predominantly, and the deactivations currently are all on the fossil side. And part of what we need to manage is that the combination of technologies that we're bringing onto the grid need to have the attributes that will be necessary to reliably operate the power grid going forward. We need to make sure that as we deal with sort of the short term, if you will, friction that comes up as we deal with some of the issues on transitioning away from fossil, that does not impede the long-term goals and mandates that are codified in the Act as we transition to 2030 and to 2040. So going to the next slide. There's a tremendous amount of transmission investment that's underway, and this will be essential for a number of reasons. In order to connect the largely zero emission resources that we have in upstate New York to the demand that is driven by the New York City metropolitan area, we can either do that by building out transmission or locating supply resources that are zero emission closer to that demand center, or quite frankly, we can do both. And given the Act itself, this really needs to be an all-in strategy in order to achieve the mandates that are captured in the policy. So you can see here that there are multiple streams of transmission investment that are underway. One that the New York ISO is closest to is the public policy transmission need process, which has resulted in transmission across the state. We are currently reviewing a Long Island public policy transmission need. The way that whole process works is the state identifies the need, we solicit proposals from developers, we evaluate them, and then ultimately make us a recommendation to the NYISO board to either approve one of those proposals for a future development. And as I mentioned, the Long Island PPTN is really at this point at the final stages. So that's excellent progress. We also have transmission build that is being incented by NYSERDA through their Tier 4 RECs. And we also have a lot of activity underway at the Public Service Commission, both on the bulk level and the local level, to make sure that as renewable energy is built out across the state, it can be connected to those end use consumers. Going to the next slide. One area that we're very focused on is how the demand will evolve through time. And there's a lot of work that's been presented and discussed on this topic, but an easy way to describe how much the system is going to change is thinking about the classically summer peaking New York power system shifting to a winter peaking system. And when you think about the objectives of the CLCPA, and you think about the electrification that is needed to decarbonize the transportation sector and the building sector, there comes to mind the full appreciation of the demands that will be placed on the power grid to achieve that vision, and the essential services that will shift to a greater dependency on the electric grid will certainly expand as we move from a summer to a winter peaking system. All of these things are things to be aware of, challenges to meet, and I think these types of forums where we engage on some of the needs are critically important to make sure we're bringing all of the information to bear. Going to the next slide. This is a snapshot of NYISO's comprehensive system planning process, and just a few remarks with respect to this. We approach planning with a multifaceted style. We provide multiple reports through time that we update, we refresh. And in the first column, you'll see the reliability planning process. This really includes long-term planning, 10+ years, scenario analysis that helps to give a view of what some of the future reliability needs as we get deeper into that 2040 timeframe will be. But we also look at a short-term assessment of reliability, which is assessing out to 5 years. And these long and short-term planning studies are very much intended to work in concert. So we are continually refining our view and supporting that reliable grid transition. In the middle column, you'll see economic planning. And the report that really captures to the largest extent our economic planning process is the System and Resource Outlook. And we work closely with the state to identify some of the scenarios that would be meaningful to consider in this long-term view of the power system. What resources are expected to come on the grid? What will exit? And how will all of this combine with respect to the policy goals that we have here in New York? And last but not least, and I already touched upon this, thinking about the transmission build out, a lot of our focus is on the public policy transmission planning process, identifying the needs, providing them to New York for consideration, and then to the extent a need is identified, going through that process to identify a potential build out to further strengthen our transmission system. Next slide, please. Okay, so now similar with what was presented earlier, here is just a running summary of the recommendations that are captured in the electric sector chapter of the scoping plan. And one additional component is the economy-wide approaches, which are also very impactful within the electric sector. So you'll see that many of the things that I just touched upon, the need to carefully consider and responsibly consider the transition away from fossil, the idea of scaling up renewable resources, storage, the idea of integrating new technologies such as distributed energy resources, advanced demand side solutions, that further integration of new storage and emerging storage technologies, the idea of building out the transmission and the distribution grid so that these clean energy electrons can reach customers. All of that is captured within the scoping plan. And when you look at the economy-wide approach, the concept of cap and invest, which was included in the New York budget, is an idea on how do you really provide a regulatory framework that will allow this economy-wide transition and manage also the idea of starting to ratchet down the dependency on fossil, along with the timeline captured in the Climate Act. So it's all here. And what is critically important is as we progress on the execution of this plan and we work through the details and the friction that will arise inevitably in such a significant transition, that we do so in a way that allows us to manage the short-term challenges while still working toward the long-term mandates that are captured in the Act. So look forward to your questions at the end of the presentations and for further conversation with the panel. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Emilie. That was a really terrific overview of the really important planning processes at the ISO and sort of the work ahead. That was excellent. For those of you that have questions regarding the presentation that we just heard, I encourage you to put them in the Q&A box. And then after we are done with all three presentations, we're going to have a full Q&A session with our three wonderful panelists. Also, I'd like to remind folks that this presentation today is being recorded and will be made available online. So happy to distribute that. I'm sure the ACE team will do that after this concludes. So with that, I'm going to turn to Josh Berman from the Sierra Club, who's going to talk more about how we're going to transition from fossil fuel infrastructure. Josh.
Thanks so much, Amanda, and thank you to Anne and the ACE folks for inviting me to participate in this. So yeah, Josh Berman, I'm a senior attorney with the Sierra Club's environmental law program. I've been supporting our legal work in New York around the electric sector and more recently around both building sector and transportation as well in New York since 2011. Emilie's presentation is a great tee up for this. I'm going to drill down more on one specific aspect of this, which is looking at what needs to happen over the next 20 years or less than 20 years now to phase out fossil fuels in New York, consistent with the reliability need and obligation that Emilie has identified. So let's go to the next slide. So for purposes of keeping this, there's a lot of pieces here, and for purposes of keeping this clearly organized, I'm going to focus first on new generation and then turn to existing fossil generation. And then at the end, throw a couple of the more recent and interesting developments at folks, which I think hopefully we'll be able to pick up more in the discussion later on. So let's go to the next slide. So just level setting in terms of what the electric sector obligations are in the climate law. As folks are, I'm sure, well aware, under the climate law, the Public Service Commission is required to develop a clean energy standard that's going to get us 70% renewable energy systems by 2030. And the PSC has already taken significant steps to effectuate this requirement through the order that they put out in the fall of 2020 in the Clean Energy Standard docket. And then additionally, the Public Service Commission is supposed to develop a plan to achieve statewide electrical demand system of zero emissions by 2040. And as of this moment, we are still waiting on action from the Public Service Commission about what that's going to look like. The commission is incidentally meeting right now. There may be an update to this forthcoming shortly, but for now, we're going to treat this as something that has not yet been addressed regulatorily. In the final scoping plan, Anne and Emilie both highlighted the suite of 10 recommendations. As folks probably saw, most of the recommendations focus on, or at least, recommendations 2 through 5 focus on bringing more clean energy resources onto the grid, consistent with meeting our 70 by 30 obligation. One of the strategies, however, focuses on how do we eliminate greenhouse gas emitting resources from the power sector. And as I noted before, this kind of encompasses both what are we going to do about new generation, and then what are we going to do about all the existing generation. So let's go to the next slide. So for new fossil generation, I'm going to flag what's common between the draft and final scoping plan, and then highlight a couple of changes that were made in the final scoping plan. In both the draft and final scoping plan, new fossil generation is identified as a resource that should only be used as a last resort, where there already exists an identified reliability need or risk, and after other zero emission solutions such as storage or transmission, energy efficiency, demand response, and the zero emission dispatchable resources that we're hearing about, all of these have been fully explored. There are a couple changes, however, that were made in the final scoping plan. The final scoping plan added language that creates a preference for alternative fuel resources, which are identified as things like hydrogen and RNG over new fossil. And it also places some guardrails around the localized impacts from those resources. As folks are probably aware, a fuel like hydrogen, when it's combusted, emits zero greenhouse gas emissions. However, it does emit nitrogen oxides, which are a local criteria or pollutant, also contribute to ground level ozone. So, there's some guidance in the final scoping plan about guardrails around localized impacts from these new alternative fuel resources. In addition, there's some language change in the final scoping plan. If you've met the above conditions about considering fossil fuel generation, there was actually a set of 5 additional conditions that needed to be met. They were joined by an and in the original. That and was changed to an or in the final scoping plan. So now it looks like if any of those conditions is met, fossil fuel generation can be considered. So in that sense, that was loosened. Let's go to the next slide. Intersecting, however, with the recommendations that are in the final scoping plan, there's another provision of the climate law that has been very impactful on power generation, and particularly on new fossil fuel generation. And that is Section 7.2. For those who aren't familiar, Section 7.2 of the climate law provides, in considering and issuing permits, all state agencies shall consider whether such decisions are inconsistent with or will interfere with the attainment of the statewide greenhouse gas emission limits. And where an agency finds that there's an inconsistency or interference, then that agency shall provide a detailed statement of justification as to why such limits or criteria may not be met, and identify alternatives or greenhouse gas mitigation measures to be required where such project is located. This is powerful language, and while it has not been sort of evenly applied by state agencies to date, the Department of Environmental Conservation, DEC, has applied this language to both of the proposed new fossil fuel power plants, both the peaking turbine, the gas peaking turbine in Astoria in Queens, as well as the Danskamer combined cycle gas plant in Newburgh, New York, and has denied new Title V air permits for those facilities under this provision. DEC also in February finalized guidance, the DAR 21 guidance, that addresses implementation of Section 7.2 in air permitting. And, from my read of that guidance is that under that guidance, most new fossil fuel power plants would be deemed inconsistent, and therefore would need to be justified and mitigated. And that justification for a fossil fuel power plant is largely going to depend on whether there's a reliability need for it. The decisions to date, because they found that the plants were not justified, have not addressed mitigation. So it's unclear what mitigation might be sufficient. But I think just sort of taking a step back, if you look at the recommendations in the final scoping plan on new fossil, and if you look at the DEC implementation of Section 7.2, I think they align pretty closely, where new fossil fuel is really going to be limited in New York and likely only occur if there is, as a last resort, if there is a real reliability need. Let's turn to the next slide. So existing fossil generation. New York has an enormous, as we saw from the slides from Anne and Emily, and New York has an enormous amount of existing fossil fuel generation. Much of it is located in zones F through K downstate, where a lot of the load in New York also is. So it is not a non-trivial exercise to maintain system reliability while phasing out that existing fossil. So there are two recommendations in the final scoping plan that I wanted to highlight. The first is a recommendation for DEC. DEC is supposed to promulgate regulations to reduce emissions from fossil fuel fired generating units to the maximum extent practicable to achieve the requirements of the Climate Act while maintaining system reliability. And in the final scoping plan, language was added that says this process should consider other regulatory programs, including a potential economy-wide program, which I've noted could be cap and invest program, as well as the regional greenhouse gas initiative, which is the current multi-state program that caps and effectively requires auctioning and sets a price on greenhouse gas emissions from larger power plants in the Northeast. The final scoping plan also requires that a special focus should be given to emissions of co-pollutants in disadvantaged communities and environmental justice communities. And I think, kind of for future discussion, flagging some open questions that remain. One of them is whether the scoping plan's proposed cap and invest program is going to obviate the need for DEC emission regulations. So how is that going to interact with the cap and invest program that is likely to be developed? Let's go to the next slide. There's also a recommendation in the final scoping plan that goes to the Public Service Commission. Every 2 years, the Public Service Commission is supposed to evaluate options to retire and or repurpose existing fossil fuel power plants. And this planning is supposed to look at options to reduce or eliminate emissions from fossil generation, including behind the meter fossil resources as expeditiously as possible, but not later than 2040. In the final scoping plan, there was language added that indicated that the initial iteration of this planning process from the Public Service Commission is going to be the blueprint that Governor Hochul announced in the 2022 State of the State, which was identified to guide the retirement and the redevelopment of New York's oldest and most polluting fossil fuel facilities and their sites by 2030. There are, I think, a number of interesting open questions about exactly what this commission PSC planning process is going to look like. I think one is, a big one in my mind, is whether the blueprint in this iterative process are going to be used to accelerate retirements of existing facilities, or whether they're simply going to be reactive to announced retirements. As folks are probably aware, in 2019, the Department of Environmental Conservation promulgated regulations that regulate NOx emissions from peaking units. This apply to combustion turbines in the New York City area. And those have driven a lot of announced retirements of older, existing, dirtier peaking units. So I think there's a question of whether kind of regulations like the NOx peaker regs are going to be what drives the retirements, or whether the sort of blueprint and iterative planning process are going to be used to actually accelerate retirements of facilities that hadn't otherwise announced announced retirements based on economic or regulatory obligations. Another question I think is really important is how local stakeholders are going to be involved in the redevelopment decisions. A number of New York City environmental justice groups have been working collaboratively with the New York Power Authority in recent years to develop plans to repurpose a number of peaking units that were built by NYPA in the early 2000s, shortly after New York deregulated its electric sector. Many of those were built kind of without a lot of siting oversight in environmental justice communities and have been real targets for environmental justice groups in the city. So they're in the final budget, there was this has been formalized, and now we will hopefully see some repurposing of those. But there's, I think, an open question about just generally how local stakeholders are going to be involved in decisions about repurposing existing plants. And then finally, I think there's an important question about how exactly the PSC's iterative planning process is going to interact with the DEC emission regulations that I flagged in the previous slide. All right, and I think I've got one more slide. So in case that wasn't enough, I'm going to throw two last things in the mix. One is an additional provision in the climate law that to date has largely been or under implemented, but I think could be very significant going forward. And that is Section 7.3. Section 7.3 provides that in this, considering and issuing permits, licenses, and other administrative approvals and decisions, all state agencies shall not disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. Would note that, you know, I flagged Section 7.2, which has already been impactful for permitting. Section 7.3 is on its face much more powerful than 7.2. In 7.2, if there is a inconsistency or incompatibility, there could nevertheless be a justification in that emissions or impacts could be mitigated. Section 7.3 on its face says that if something is going to have a disproportionate, that shall not disproportionately burden. So there's not really on its face a space for justifying or otherwise mitigating away impacts. So that to date, though, we haven't seen any implementation of Section 7.3, that despite a lot of efforts by a number of groups in New York to try to elevate this provision. Additionally, as folks I'm sure are aware, in the final budget, we got a little bit of information about some of the contours of what future economy-wide cap and invest program are going to look like. The final scoping plan recommends an economy-wide cap and invest program. The final budget includes, it establishes 3 accounts that would direct where some of the funds that would be raised by this cap and invest program would go. One of them is about mitigating cost increases from the program, and that's going to be at least 30% of the funds. One is about mitigating impacts to small New York businesses. That's up to 3%. And then the last one is about effectuating the recommendations in the final scoping plan, and that's at least 67%. So we have that amount of information to date, but there's obviously a lot of development that's going to need to happen around what a cap and invest program is going to look like. And then I'll just close by just noting a couple of open questions that we may hopefully get to in the Q&A. One is, you know, how is Section 7.3 going to be implemented in permitting of fossil fuel facilities? We understand that the Department of Environmental Conservation has been working on guidance, which may be released shortly, and that will obviously give us a lot more information than we've had to date. In addition, I think there's an open question about whether the cap and invest program is going to include the electric sector. As folks know, the electric sector in New York is already part of a cap and invest program through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So there's a question about whether it would be included as well in New York. There's also related to the DEC emission regulation obligation. If the electric sector is omitted, the DEC emission regulations that are supposed to be developed under the scoping plan might end up substituting for that program. And then finally, I think there's an open question about what role air permitting in particular is going to play in the fossil fuel phase out. Air permitting would obviously be a much more ad hoc way of addressing the phase out of fossil fuels than the sort of iterative planning process that's envisioned for the Public Service Commission. So we'll close with that. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Josh. That was a really excellent presentation on how it is, or the challenges in front of us, and actually transitioning away from fossil fuel infrastructure. As Emilie talked about, the planning process is underway and the need to think about reliability, also thinking about how we're then transitioning away from fossil fuel infrastructures is a really important layer on all of this. And that was a really wonderful presentation. Next, we're going to hear from Vlad Gutman-Britten from the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Take it away, Vlad.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Are my slides up, or am I just not seeing them? Oh, there they go. Sorry. Thank you. So yeah, I'm happy to be with you all today. I was happy to work with Anne and so many of the other stakeholders here and across the state of New York as one of the contributors to the scoping plan and to the electricity chapter. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about what the scoping plan sort of said about what it predicted about the future of our energy system and how electricity figures into that. And close with maybe some of the open questions that the scoping plan raised and that we all know that are before us that some of the other panelists spoke to. So on the next slide, just a summary of the overall kind of energy, the overall sort of energy conclusions from the scoping plan, because obviously as we're talking about electricity, it is attempting to serve the broader needs of the state as we pursue our decarbonization goals, which others have covered before. Energy efficiency and end-use electrification are essential parts across all sectors of achieving our state goals. That in the building sector, and that's pretty clear. We need to stop burning fossil fuels to heat building spaces and water and other energy demands, and we need to transition as much of the economy to using efficient end-use electric heating sources as possible. In the transportation sector, both those strategies apply. We need to deeply electrify our transportation sector, and energy efficiency in that space takes the form of reductions in driving, right? We need to make it, we need to expand transit service. We need a wide proliferation of compact walkable communities, transportation demand management, make it easier for people to opt out of driving alone. That's how we reduce energy use in the transportation sector. And similar strategies apply in industry and beyond. Renewable energy is by far the majority of energy consumption in New York by 2050 across all of the pathways we tested and all of its sensitivities. And even part of that strategy and minimizing the cost with that strategy requires aggressively managing load, reducing energy use, shifting loads around. But even with those changes, we're radically transforming our electricity system in ways that we have to prepare for starting years ago, which we've been doing, and accelerate over the coming years. And low carbon fuels, alternative fuels like biofuels and hydrogen play a small but really essential role as a complement to electricity in serving the needs of the state. So on the next slide, focusing staying economy wide, really kind of underscoring why electricity is such a central component of the transition is that, while it's a minority of energy consumption today, it becomes far more than 2/3 of energy of how energy is consumed in New York by 2050. And then you can see that remainder, while there's some other sources there still being used, hydrogen and bioenergy, those alternative fuels are also making a substantial contribution to about the last quarter of energy consumption. But electricity, hydrogen, and bioenergy together are delivering the energy needs that New York has by mid-century, with electricity sort of being the dominant source. On the next slide, we can see what that means for energy consumption. Across all the three core scenarios that we tested, which evaluated different strategies for achieving the state's goals that are compliant with the CLCPA and its very tailored view on calculating and tabulating greenhouse gas emissions, we essentially double electricity energy consumption by mid-century. So that varies a little bit. The strategic use of low carbon fuels, scenario 2, which is the scenario that kind of used more bioenergy and more hydrogen than the other scenarios, still is an electrification dominant case. So while we're not quite getting to 100% in that one, it's a 94% increase in electricity energy usage by mid-century, and that translates on the next slide to peak demands that are also substantially increased, but not to the same extent as we see energy use being used. the lowest peak growth is in scenario 2, with about 54% increases in peak demand by mid-century, and that's really associated with, again, that substantial expansion electrification, but paired with really aggressive strategies to really manage that use. So the integration analysis, the scoping plan, spent time looking at incorporating both ways to shift demand as well as to reduce it. So building shells, weatherization, and things like that are really essential, and efficiency first approach to decarbonizing our building sector is a really important component of the strategies laid out here. But shifting that demand around so that we can kind of reflect flexibility and what the economy, what individual consumers and businesses can do is really essential for really muting costs. And that's why you see that that's why you see substantial growth in peaks, but it's not as fast as the energy as energy growth itself. And as as previous speakers have sort of indicated, as Emilie described, New York would shift in the mid 2030s to a winter peaking system as more and more of our heating it begins to be served by heat pumps. On the next slide, you can see sort of what this means for the energy mix and the kinds of resources that we deploy. So this set of scenarios is, I think Anne at the top showed the builds under the core scenario 3. This is actually a different one. This is scenario 2, but with IRA incorporated. And the story is actually largely the same between what Anne showed at the beginning and what I'm showing here. But there are some subtle shifts, for example, in reduced wind imports and a few other pieces like that. But fundamentally, what you see here is an overwhelmingly renewable system: solar and wind, offshore wind and land-based wind, really a dominant source of supply. Really meaningful contributions from our existing nuclear and hydro fleets, and then we've identified a zero carbon firm resource. This was modeled in the scoping plan as hydrogen. In scenario 2, the hydrogen was combusted. In scenario 3, it was used in fuel cells. But that was sort of just as a way to represent a potential resource, not as a recommendation that it should be hydrogen necessarily, but just to characterize the behavior of the system under this use. And so what's that's a really important kind of component to how we get to a low carbon electricity system. And the analysis deployed about 17 gigawatts of this zero carbon firm capacity by 2050. And while it represents about 12% of installed capacity by mid-century, it is really contributing a very small amount of energy, about 1.4% of total energy. And that's because we still see the bulk of energy needs being delivered by these other resources, but really making sure that we're attentive to what that transition looks like and what that kind of that resource is really going to carry New York through some of the more difficult weeks of every year when renewables are not generating at the times at the times when demand is highest. And really, happy to say, as others have already spoken to, NYSERDA is really working across each and every one of these components to really deliver on that future. Energy storage is a really essential pathway for integrating renewables into the grid, and part of the reason why the energy contribution of that zero carbon firm resources is relatively small. At the end of last year, NYSERDA and DPS filed the Energy Storage Roadmap proposal that we are now waiting on action from the Public Service Commission to deliver 6 gigawatts of energy storage by 2030. A new kind of mechanism for providing sort of financial surety and de-risking deployment of energy storage. We have New York Sun, which is targeted at a 10 gigawatt deployment goal for distributed solar resources over the coming years, and of course our large-scale renewable program, which is bringing in major new the largest transmission investments in decades in New York. Of course, offshore wind, solar wind resources as well. And NYSERDA is a close partner with DPS, with the NYISO, and with energy stakeholders across the state on the other components that folks have talked about. Additional transmission beyond Tier 4, long-term planning to really integrate a substantially renewable system into our electric grid over the coming years. And really, what's important is that while we're shooting for while the law requires us to target 2040 zero emission electricity, the reality is that with our existing resources, with our nuclear fleet and the 70% renewables that we are required to deliver by 2030, the New York electricity is going to be near zero, not totally zero, but near zero much sooner than that 2040 target. But there are a lot of questions on the next slide. There are a lot of questions that still remain. The 70 by 30 pathway is challenging. It's achievable, but relatively clear. And what happens after 2030 is much less clear at this time. Josh, I think earlier on was mentioning the requirement that the PSC start answering questions in the CLCPA requirement. The PSC address questions about what 100 by 40 looks like. I think he'll be happy to know that while he was speaking, the PSC was voting in the affirmative to open a proceeding on that question and issued a notice for comment and a series of questions to start soliciting feedback from the public and from energy stakeholders on that issue. But we really need to chart that path starting today. We need to know what resources qualify for that zero emission electricity definition by 2040. We need to know what the future of the ZEC program is and our existing nuclear fleet. How can hydrogen be used? On the right there is a graphic that also from the scoping plan that really identified some of the substantial cost impacts of some of these choices. If we don't have existing nuclear relicensing, scenario 3 would have $7.6 billion higher cost than the core scenario. If in scenario 3 we allow combustion of hydrogen, that brings down cost by about $7 billion. And if RNG is considered to be a zero carbon resource, that's a further reduction of about $3 billion. So these are really essential decisions. It's even as that kind of zero carbon firm resource is potentially a small contributor to serving energy needs. It's a very disproportionate, has a disproportionate impact on the cost and reliability of the system. And then on my last slide, another component of this sort of what is 100 by 40 mean is a sensitivity we did that incorporated an optimistic projection of nuclear costs coupled with the IRA. And we found that in fact, advanced nuclear under these conditions can potentially contribute to New York's energy future. There's about 4 gigawatts of advanced nuclear deployed in this scenario. It reduces costs for the scoping plan by a little over $1 billion. But this is far from the final answer to this question. There's many questions, as the scoping plan identified, that need to be answered about all of these resources. And with nuclear, we need to make sure that we're addressing questions about safety, about where to site these resources, the readiness of the technology, especially on our time frame, and a variety of other components. So as I and I think others have said, we know a lot, but there's a huge amount that we still don't know, and I'm looking forward to answering those questions in collaboration with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vlad. That was excellent and a really exciting way, since you posed so many important questions, to segue into Q&A. So all of our panelists are going to be on video now, and we're going to have a question and answer session, largely going off of the Q&A that you all have put into the chat. So thank you so much for participating. Really to kick us off from these, 3 really important presentations that we heard today. I guess I have sort of a little bit of a combined question for many of the things that we're hearing, but we talked a lot about the different tools in our toolbox to achieve these goals. We talked about permitting, we talked about procurement, we talked about planning for transmission. I guess sort of a bigger question, I'd like you all to sort of talk a little bit from your perspective. How do we really put all of these pieces together, and what does the action from the state look like to really comprehensively move forward and achieve these the important goals in the electric sector? And how do we sort of bring all of these different pieces together? Vlad, you're big on my. Oh, Emilie, please go ahead.
Oh, I see. I unclicked just a second too soon. So that's a great question, Amanda. And I think that's part of what we are trying to figure out with discussions like this, and with some of the regulatory actions that Vlad just mentioned, the PSC is contemplating. So there's not there's not just one thing that's going to move us forward, right? So on the reliability side, having the planning studies both on the long and the short term to identify those issues, solicit solutions, market-based solutions, regulatory solutions before we transition off fossil that's necessary for reliability is one important piece. Thinking about how to incent the supply side build out that's necessary through the work that NYSERDA is doing with the Clean Energy Standard in the RECs, and through the continued evolution of the wholesale markets to provide more of a market signal that's more granular, local, and will support that reliability function is another necessary piece. We've all talked quite a bit about transmission and that investment needs to continue to happen. So there is a tremendous amount of activity and work that is underway, and in comparison to 10 years ago, the last 10 years have seen a substantial change. I think we all need to be prepared and embracing that rate of change is going to increase even more dramatically. And that's where, it requires just rolling up your sleeves and thinking about how do you deal with the permitting, the interconnection, all of these components that are so critical to move even more quickly without compromising what we need in the electric grid, which is reliability and the opportunity for resources to come in and compete.
Thanks, Emilie. And, sort of an additional question that might help the panelists jump in a bit here too is, another thing that several of you have mentioned and has come up in the chat is in fact the PSC is meeting right now. And, importantly, we know that a piece of this is a proceeding around achieving that 100% by 2040. So, another question is, what does that proceeding need to look like? And what are the key aspects that need to be included in order to achieve these goals?
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit here, Amanda. I was picking up on what Emilie was just saying. I think a key thing is going to be de-siloing. We have looked at a lot of things traditionally in a fairly narrow manner, and that's been adequate. But I think, again, given the breadth and scope of the changes that have been identified, both with in terms of what we need sort of at a very localized scale, but then also at in terms of transmission, in terms of generation, I think, that kind of something of the ilk of the coordinated grid planning proceeding, but something that really is trying to look at solutions across, all the different resources at the same time, is going to be really critical to keeping the costs down for this transition, because obviously, you can sort of bludgeon your way towards some of these solutions through taking out some individual facility here because it has a permit up, or, going after, transmission as the solution. But if we're thinking about these things in sort of a too parochial a way and not trying to connect them all, I think ultimately we're going to end up with solutions that are going to be more costly. And I think, again, it's going to be more challenging to maintain the grid reliability that Emilie has been emphasizing.
I think that the desilization is right. I mean, in another chapter in the scoping plan, in the gas transition chapter, there was an enormous amount of ink dedicated to this question of not the electric sector alone, but thinking about how to transition to the electric system in a way that is consistent with our understanding of what it needs, of how it operates, of ways to minimize its costs, of its limitations, and things like that. So that even though a lot of this talk is about that, this particular chapter of the electricity system, almost every chapter, well, I don't know if it's almost, but many of the other chapters of the scoping plan are also looking at how do they achieve their goals in context of an electric system that also needs to evolve and meet the challenge. The reality is we do have to do all these things at once. If we had started the process of decarbonization more affirmatively in 1990, as some had advocated, certainly doing more sequential thinking might have been okay. But the reality is at this point we have to do much more concurrent thinking. And I think even this discussion hasn't been fully comprehensive. I don't think anyone has really talked about, because they're a week old, what the EPA 111 rules will do to the electricity system and how that'll really transform existing facilities that we're talking about now and their contribution to our emissions, and how does that fit in with the CLCPA? And I'm not teeing that up because I am about to answer that question. But the point is that this is
But you should, because somebody asked it, so feel
that's
free.
what somebody asked it. Yeah. But New York certainly exists in a much broader context. It exists. We trade energy with our neighboring regions. Our relationship with Quebec is certainly an essential part of how we're going to be decarbonizing our grid in the next 7 years and beyond. And understanding how we exist in that federal context is more than just about how does IRA subsidize our deployment of clean resources, but also how our sort of mutual dependency on our neighboring regions is going to impact our future as well.
Can I
Yeah, and I would,
oh, sorry,
please,
Amanda,
Josh.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, just picking up on that, though, I do think New York is uniquely well situated, at least among the states in this region of the country, is uniquely well situated in having a state-specific ISO. I think that enables New York to do things, and I think the close coordination that NYISO has had with a lot of New York state agencies and entities puts New York in a good position. I think, I've also worked in New England, I have colleagues who work in New England. I think the challenges there are quite different, having states not all be aligned in terms of their goals. And so I think having New York sending a clear signal to New York Independent System Operator about what it's trying to achieve, I think then puts NYISO in a better position to support that than I think we're seeing necessarily with ISO New England.
Absolutely. I want to put a finer point on something we've talked a little bit about in some of the questions in the chat, but something we haven't directly said. Vlad, you talked about sort of the other chapters of the scoping plan. Of course, most of those strategies are to electrify. And so something we haven't said yet today, but is really important and how we're thinking about it, is that we actually need to double our load by mid-century. So, we're talking about sort of all of these challenges and the tale of two grids and what New York City's grid looks like versus that as the rest of the state. And then on top of that, need to think about actually how we're going to double our load by mid-century, which is a pretty big task. So can you guys talk a little bit more about how is it that we can really think about, okay, so we're intending to retire these fossil fuel generating facilities in New York City, while we also need to double our load, and how do we ensure reliability, costs, and just the ability to drive to clean energy in the future?
I guess I'll jump in. So you mentioned doubling the load in the NYISO system and resource outlook that we published. When you think about the installed capacity that's on the grid, currently we have about 37 gigawatts of installed capacity. And from that perspective, that could be as much as 3 times what we currently have in order to achieve the 2040 mandate. So there's a reason that so many of my opening comments focused on the need for investment in infrastructure, both on the transmission and supply side, because that is a tremendous number. And I think the reality, if we're going to be honest about this, we don't know all of the answers on how we're going to achieve that end state, right? The other side of the reality, though, is we're sitting here in 2023, and there's a lot of progress that can be made until we're at that point where you're dealing with the most challenging of issues, like we've been talking about, the zero emission resources that need to come into fruition. And I think the first thing that I looked for in the final scoping plan was really the concept that this plan is allowed to evolve, because we need to take in the new information, the new technologies, the good and the bad, to make adjustments so that we're continuing to make that progress. So anyone who sits here at this point in time and says everything's figured out for the next 20 years, I think we should kind of just laugh them off the stage. But we know many of the things that are going to be necessary in order to make that forward progress. And quite frankly, a lot of it is underway now.
Well, thanks for that, Emilie, and that's fair advice. One of the tools that we mentioned and talked about, and really exciting progress in this year's budget, is cap and invest. And that continues to assert New York State's leadership in this area, and of course is incredibly exciting. But you talked, Emilie, just now about the investments that are going to be necessary to get there. And there is this question of, well, will cap and invest include this sector? Will we be including the electric sector here? And so I guess a question is, knowing that we don't know all the answers, but should cap and invest not include this? What are the proceedings, or what does sort of the world need to look like in order for us to get these necessary investments in transmission and generation to meaningfully move this forward? Vlad,
I'll offer one thought on cap and invest, and then see if Vlad and Josh have other things they want to add in. One of the elements that we're anxiously awaiting, I know we all are, is how the regulations unfold to codify what needs to be achieved in the act itself. And cap and invest is put forth as a concept to allow for this transition and this set of regulations. One opportunity with respect to including the electric sector more broadly in an economy-wide cap and invest approach is that you're going to start bringing the policy objectives into the wholesale markets as a signal of what needs to be achieved. And there is a divergence between where RGGI price is clear and what New York is trying to achieve. So if the cap and invest approach is more narrowly tailored, then one of my assignments, along with other stakeholders, will be how do we make sure we're taking full advantage of the wholesale markets? That'll be important for all of the reasons that we've talked about today.
Thanks, Emilie. And also, you answered another question in the Q&A. Vlad, Josh, anything you want to say on any of these topics here?
I've gotten used to, over the last several months, providing unsatisfying answers to people on cap and invest, and I'm happy to do that today, which is the DEC and NYSERDA. We're going to be engaging in a robust and public stakeholder process and rulemaking, and so it's important for us to hear from the public, from industry stakeholders, and many others about the sort of considerations that go into a cap and invest design, the sectors that will cover. We know that no cap and invest system anywhere that exists can obligate the entire economy. Not all of the parts of the economy are easily regulated through a system like this. And so there will need to be choices about, which portions of the economy cap and invest is well suited to address. We know that we need to hear from people about the interactions between RGGI, between the clean energy standard and the sort of regulatory requirement to deliver on 100% clean electricity, and how that could potentially interact with the New York cap and invest program. And other components like that, but that is certainly one of the topics that both these entities are certainly eager to hear from the public about. Structuring wholesale markets in order to make sure that we're properly valuing the unique contributions of all these resources, I think, can go a very long way to addressing the gap. But there's also a role that is not just within the structure of the wholesale markets. That is why we have a clean energy standard that is providing additional compensation to renewables for their sort of environmental and compliance attributes. That's why NYSERDA and DPS have proposed the energy storage roadmap to do that as well. So the cooperation of policy with the structure of the wholesale markets is what's going to drive this particular bus to a zero emission system by 2040.
Sounds like we'll have an opportunity to weigh in with NYSERDA and DEC on the development of the regulation. But I would say, I do think the electric sector is particularly well suited to cap and invest. I would note that Massachusetts has managed, despite the existence of RGGI, to layer on a state-specific cap on electric generation and have facility-specific obligations to procure allowances under that state cap. So it certainly can be layered together with RGGI. And I think Emilie made a really important point, which is right that the RGGI price signal right now is nothing close to this actual social cost of carbon. And so, that the power generation is still not internalizing the real full cost of its emissions. And then picking up on Vlad's point, I think it's important also that the benefit of putting the electric sector in a cap and invest program is that then the state can direct where the fund, where the revenue that's collected goes. I think that there are some challenges to trying to do that through the wholesale markets, though Emilie, I'm sure, is much more expert in this and may have good solutions to that. But I do think cap and invest lends itself nicely to then, having those, that funding then line up with the funding allocations that were in the budget bill.
Thanks. That was great, everybody. There are a fair amount of questions in the chat that I want to make sure that I reflect in some manner. And it's a lot of questions about sort of what counts and what doesn't. So, you know, there is a significant question, and Vlad, you talked about it in some of your slides, you know, particularly with respect to how different kinds of resources can implicate costs or sort of help us meet those zero emissions, that sort of nexus, which is really critical. You know, particularly, and maybe I should ask this in the context of the 100 by 2040 or sort of other kind of proceedings, what should count and what shouldn't with respect to these resources, and what are the considerations that the state should sort of put on the table when determining that?
I'm sorry, did you ask me what should count as a clean resource?
Yes, and it's sort of for everybody. I mean, the questions in the chat have asked about renewable natural gas. They have asked about nuclear. They have asked about several other sort of sources, hydrogen, certainly. And so as we think about that, you know, I think people are sort of raising, there are different impacts that we need to consider in these contexts. What, you know, in consideration of those, what should count as the state is considering this path forward?
I am as eager as anybody else to hear the answers to those questions. The PSC proceeding that just opened has a, I'm in charge of unsatisfying answers today, I guess. But the PSC proceeding that just
Up in there, it's okay.
that just opened asks a lot of those points, right? I mean, New York has currently 2 accounting mechanisms for considering greenhouse gases. It has its gross accounting mechanism, which treats certain resources one way, and it has its net accounting mechanism, which treats them in a different way. And so understanding how different resources, you know, are considered zero emission under one, but maybe not under the other, and how that matches up with the obligations of the CLCPA. Those are some of the things that need to be explored. Ultimately, we know that complying with the CLCPA, with the climate transition, is a transition that will yield profound benefits for New York. 200,000 new jobs by 2030, substantial benefits to health, and, you know, and a variety of other kind of benefits like that. But we also know that it's not going to come at no cost. So as we kind of consider this transition, we should take opportunities to, even as we know that the transition will outweigh the cost, we should still take opportunities to minimize the burden where we can. And so as we kind of look at that transition and what the choices we have are, we can and must and will comply with both the letter and the spirit of the law, and we will do so. We need to do so in a way that does so reliably and as affordably as possible.
Thanks, Vlad. I have a follow-up question for you, but before I get there, I want to see if Josh or Emilie have anything they want to share on sort of their perspective of sort of these different kinds of technologies and what should count.
I have a very general comment, which is, please, when we think about the transition away from fossil, we are going to need a wide variety of technologies that in combination can provide the attributes that we need. I've mentioned this, but we need to be able to bring resources on quickly, on a sustained basis, dispatchable. One of the challenges that the state has pointed out, that the NYISO has pointed out, is periods of extended wind lulls will mean that we need to have other solutions to provide that energy when New York demands that energy. So certainly we are technology agnostic, but keeping options open because this will be incredibly challenging. There's a lot of unknowns, probably will maximize our chances for success. So we need a diversity of resources with a lot of different attributes to be successful in this transition.
Thanks, Emilie. Those are important considerations. Josh.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much tricky stuff to avoid wading into here, but I will just say, like, going to a point Emilie made earlier, I think we want to get as far as we can with the resources that are obviously CLCPA compliant. There are a lot of zero emission resources. If you look back at what we were doing 17 years ago, we were still proposing to build new coal plants. I was still working opposing new coal plants in the Midwest. So we're in a very different situation. In 17 years, I think technology and cost considerations are going to be quite different. I'm a little wary of locking ourselves into committing to resources that we have concerns about from an emissions, public health, climate perspective. So I think obviously I'm glad the PSC is asking these questions now, but going to Emilie's point, I think there's I think we can get a long way towards where we need to go with resources that are obviously CLCPA compliant, and really need to make sure we're eliminating the barriers to getting all of those onto the grid in a safe and reliable way as quickly as possible.
Does anyone want to talk a little bit more? So all of these questions are really important. This question of, there a few things that we've heard that answer some of the questions in the chat that I just want to touch on. One is, with respect to cap and invest and where revenues go, there's going to be a public stakeholder process that not only talks about, what sort of how, when we talk about economy wide, what does that include, but also where the investments from cap and invest will go. So that was something we heard today responsive to some of the questions. And then with respect to sort of what counts and not, with respect to renewable natural gas, hydrogen, other things, it sounds like, Vlad, what you're saying is that in the context of the 100 by 2040 proceeding, which the PSC just kicked off today, some of those questions will be answered. Is that right? And do you want to talk a little bit about this late breaking news from the Public Service Commission?
Well, I certainly would never dream of speaking on behalf of the Public Service Commission, but I do think that is the set of questions that the state needs to hear from folks on. There is so we need to at the same time solve for a zero carbon a zero emission power system by 2040 for reliability and for affordability simultaneously. And the questions that the PSC is asking are both about the eligibility, what resources count, as well as those complementary pieces. And that, Josh is right. The 70% is the floor for renewable energy, which is, I take it, what you mean by obviously compliant with CLCPA, but it is certainly not the ceiling, and all of our modeling energy from renewables far exceeds that floor by 2050. And so that doesn't, there are these essential contributions for sort of smoothing out that variability from, and that's a combination of storage and dispatchable resources that are sort of available on demand in the way that Emilie described, because we need resources of different characteristics to complement the variability of other ones and the sort of patterns of generation. But those are the kind of the three pillars that will map our future to 2040, and all of them are open questions the PSC just asked. And it'll be certainly a long road. We need to answer those questions, compile that information, think about programmatic implementation, think about whether or not our policy in our markets are currently set to deliver on those solutions. They're almost certainly not, which isn't a criticism of any of the status quo. It's just that this is as everyone has said, is a substantial transition, and so we need to accommodate. We need a market and regulatory structure that reflects the changing character of our grid, which is going to change faster the next 30 years than it has, I don't know, since the 70s maybe, or something like that. So,
thanks, Vlad. There are so many good questions in this chat here. A couple people have asked about the Build Public Renewables Act that was included in the budget and what role that may or may not play. And since several people asked about it, I want to ask all of you, how do you see it? We don't have anybody from NYPA here on the line, so feel free to say whatever you think is representative of them. But I'm curious, in response to these questions that were being asked, if you see that playing a role in our future implementation of the CLCPA.
From the ISO's perspective, we need to reliably interconnect any of these resources that are viable, that are trying to connect to the grid, and we need to provide mechanisms to operate them and participate in the market. So regardless if it's NYPA or other parties that are bringing these technologies to bear, our mission remains the same as far as making sure they're integrated.
Thank you for that good answer from the ISO, Emilie. Since you just went there, I'm just going to ask, we've also been asked a couple of questions about interconnection. And, we know we have the steep hill to climb to get all of these renewables online. Several people have asked about siting, which is a challenge. We've talked about just the need to bring so much more generation online to achieve our goals, particularly in really constrained areas like New York City. How can we ensure that the interconnection process is sort of keeping up to allow these renewable energy projects to come online?
Sure. So I think the interconnection process is really a universal challenge because across the country, we've just seen such a steep increase in the amount of resources that need to be studied and reliably interconnected. We in New York, earlier there was discussion about sometimes there's an advantage for being a single state ISO because the policy is clear, and we work to implement that policy or be part of the transition that accommodates the policy. So with respect to the interconnection, we are working through with stakeholders right now ideas on how to keep the parts that are essential for this reliable interconnection, remove those parts that are less value add or not value add, and figure out how to overhaul the whole process to just move through more efficiently. And of course, we need to do that while we continue to do the day job and work through the projects that are already in the queue. That being said, it's essential, it's critical. We have a great team working on this. We have stakeholder support and interest on this. So like many other things, I have no doubt that in a few weeks, few months, in the short term, we will make significant progress on this. Of course, at the federal level, FERC may issue a notice of proposed rulemaking and actually issue an order on this regard, but we can't afford to wait. So we're moving ahead and trying to figure out the right solution for New York so that this doesn't become an impediment on this transition.
Thanks so much, Emilie. I really appreciate all your contributions today. And we are almost at time. So I actually want to offer all three panelists, if you'd like, to provide any closing thoughts. This has been a really robust discussion. I think we've heard a lot today that there's a lot of unanswered questions, but we have the right people around the table to solve the problems. And that's in fact what the state is doing collectively with input from stakeholders and really important leadership at the ISO, at NYSERDA, at NYPA, at DPS, at DEC, and other relevant agencies. So with that, any closing thoughts from our panelists? Emilie, we can start with you just because you're on my screen, not to put you on the spot. So
okay. Sure, happy to kick it off. Just very high level. There is no doubt that there are a number of challenges that need to be successfully confronted to manage this transition in a reliable manner. I saw a few questions come in through the chat on reliability. Certainly, we have the processes to assess this transition, to assess each and every fossil deactivation, to bring forward solutions to make sure that reliability is preserved, enhanced as we move forward. And I do just want to mention that one of the things I find most heartening is that I have not once heard disagreement on that point, right? So everyone appreciates, recognizes, and is working toward the idea that a clean transition is in the act, but so is a reliable transition. And certainly the PSC keeping safeguards on it being an affordable transition is all part of what we need to work collectively toward. Thanks.
Thanks, Emilie. That was great. Josh, over to you.
Sure. So I guess, I take great comfort in the fact that, folks on today from NYSERDA and NYISO are approaching these issues so thoughtfully, and we, seem with, I think, a very similar set of goals to the Sierra Club. I guess one thing that occurred to me earlier that I kind of just want to pick up is, we are hearing a lot of excitement, enthusiasm about things like hydrogen in a lot of other sectors. And I just think we just need to be very mindful that if we are really going to, for instance, be, putting lots of hydrogen into our gas pipeline system, what the implications of that are for exacerbating the challenges of decarbonizing the electric sector, from a energy from a renewable resource standpoint, it's extremely inefficient to take electricity to electrolyze water, to create hydrogen, to then stick into our pipelines to burn in our homes. So just want to make sure that we are not making things more challenging for ourselves, and we're really focusing on least cost solutions. And that just noting that the implications of what we're talking about today for the other sectors, and I'm sorry I didn't get to hear the seminar on buildings, but I absolutely think that we need to be thinking intelligently about how to not have our building sector do more to exacerbate the issues that we need to address here in the electric sector.
Thank you, Josh. And Vlad, to close us off.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I always try and keep two things in my head, which is this is both very difficult to do and also very doable to achieve. And I think it's important to maintain optimism about both the technological and policy and business environment that we can create as a result of this transition, while also remembering that we need to find ways to simplify it, to reduce burdens, and to maximize benefits to those that are most burdened today. So that's a challenge that NYSERDA is dedicated to, and that we're really excited to work with all of the people on this call and so many more on.
Well, great. Thank you so much to our three really incredible panelists here today. Again, that's Emilie Nelson from the New York State Independent System Operator, Josh Berman from the Sierra Club, and of course, Vlad from NYSERDA. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Ann Reynolds, the head of the Alliance for Clean Energy. Thank you.
Which leaves me also to say thank you to the three panelists, and also to Amanda for her moderating and for joining us today. First of all, these were people who really know what they're talking about and are spending time thinking about these long-term issues, really important topics. And if anything, the fact that the Public Service Commission just kicked off a process to define what emissions-free means, so we can get to that 100% emissions-free by 2040, it is at least an illustration that there's something happening every day in energy policy here in New York State. Most days, though, here at ACE New York, we're focusing on that 2030 goal of how do we get wind, solar, hydroelectric projects built to get to 70 by 30? How do we get storage projects deployed and transmission projects approved so we can deliver that power? So it is good to take a step back from that and think about the longer term goals too. Thank you again to Amanda, to Emilie, Josh, and Vlad, and for all of you for joining us and listening in to find out what's in New York's climate scoping plan. Thanks so much. Take care, folks.